My wife asked if she could travel to Paris with her boss. The naturalness of the question was what unnerved me most. She didn't stutter, didn't hesitate, didn't show any discomfort. She simply asked like someone asking to go out with a friend for the weekend. I stared at her for a few seconds. Her glass of wine was still half empty. Our food was getting cold on the plate. I didn't ask anything else. I just said, "You can go, but single." And what happened there, at that dinner table, wasn't an argument. There were no shouts or tears. It was worse. Her silence screamed louder than any fight we'd ever had. She stared at me for long seconds, as if betrayed by my answer, as if my refusal to accept the absurd situation were a crime. But I didn't need to repeat myself. I got up from my chair, looked at her one last time, and said with cruel calm, "Trust can't be begged for." She went. With her fantasy. With her ego. With the certainty that she would be desired, loved, chosen. And I stayed. I stayed with the pain she left on that table, with the image of our history being dismantled by simple words, spoken as if they carried no weight. I stayed with the sound of her heels walking to the door and the smell of the perfume I'd always loved, now suffocating. But I didn't care, I didn't chase after her. Because deep down, right then and there, I already knew, she wasn't going to Paris. She was going to get lost. The following days were long and empty. The pillow beside her still bore the shape of the face that used to sleep there. But little by little, I began to accept absence as healing. I began to remember everything I'd kept silent for years, the small disappointments, the disconnected glances at dinner, the way she smiled more at her phone than at me, the nights she'd lie on her other side while I pretended everything was fine. And I realized how much we deceive ourselves when we love someone who hasn't been there for a long time. She, meanwhile, discovered the opposite. She discovered that the brilliance of adventure has a time limit. That desire without love is volatile. That those who call us special today may ignore us tomorrow. And what hurt most, for her, wasn't the other's contempt. It was remembering my response that night. Because she didn't believe I would let her. That I would have the strength to turn the page. She thought I would beg. That I would despair. That I would wait for her. But I didn't stay. I moved on. And moving on wasn't simple. It wasn't instantaneous. I cried. I was angry. I questioned my own dignity. But then, something unexpected happened. I met someone. It wasn't on a romantic date. It was by chance. A light conversation. A calm gaze. A silent presence that demanded nothing of me other than my peace. And that's when I understood, true love doesn't test, doesn't measure strength, doesn't confuse. It simply respects. She returned weeks later. She entered the house as if time could be erased. She sat at the same table. She wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. But I no longer needed explanations. I listened to her like someone listening to an old song they no longer miss. She talked about her boss, about the disappointments, about the promises that went up in smoke, about the loneliness she found in Paris. She talked and talked, until, finally, she burst into dry tears. The cry of someone who understands there is no return for someone who tears apart what was whole. When she asked if there was still a chance, I smiled. A serene smile. One of those smiles that pain taught me to create. And I said, I forgive you. But not to go back. I forgive you so I don't carry this with me. And in that moment, her silence was even louder than that night at dinner. Only now, it was a silence of loss. She had nothing left to take from me. No reaction. No plea. Just a mirror of everything she'd chosen. Time passed. She drifted away, but never disappeared. She sometimes tried to strike up a conversation. She sent messages with old photos. She commented on dates. But she never got what she wanted. I didn't block her. I didn't delete her. I just didn't respond. Because some responses hurt more when they're given with absence. And she, I know, felt every single one of them. Years later, I was in a cafe. Next to the woman who patiently rebuilt me. She held my hand while reading something on her phone. And it was there, without warning, that my ex appeared. She stopped in front of us. She looked at me. She smiled with a mixture of guilt and longing. And before she could say anything, the woman next to me said, "Thank you for setting him free." My ex froze. He swallowed the words that could never be said again. And he left. Alone. Just like he came back from Paris. This is a story about choices. About loves that are tested until they break. About the silence that screams louder than 1,000 apologies. And about how, sometimes, true forgiveness is moving on without looking back. But what did she discover, after that, she'll never forget. Because when she thought she could go back and have it all over again, she found something she never expected, me in a suit, standing at the altar, with another woman. And the worst part? She was invited, but as a friend of one of the godparents. She accepted the invitation, unaware of anything. She entered the ceremony calmly, smiling, until she saw me there, holding hands with another bride. Now tell me, what would you do if the love of your life saw you marry someone who treated you exactly the way you always dreamed? What she did in that moment, well, that part, you'll need to hear until the end. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize or justify any kind of betrayal, on the contrary, we believe it corrodes, destroys, and irreversibly scars lives. All the stories you hear are fiction, but the feelings they evoke are real. The goal is clear, to show how one wrong choice can cost the love of a lifetime. Now take a deep breath, prepare your heart. Because what you're about to hear next is a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. They met on a random afternoon, as if life's great encounters didn't need a special setting. Julia was late for a meeting, and Matthew, as usual, stopped at the corner coffee shop to buy the strong black coffee that sustained him through long workdays. She bumped into him as she hurried out, spilling half of it on his white shirt. It was the kind of situation that usually results in a quick apology and life moving on, but it wasn't. He smiled, said everything was fine, and offered her another coffee, just so the exchange wouldn't end there. What should have been a simple gesture of kindness turned into conversation. Conversation turned into interest. And interest, over time, became routine. They didn't know it at the time, but the beginning of that relationship would become the center of everything in their lives, for better or worse. Matthew was a reserved, rational type, but with a natural kindness that required no effort. He worked as a financial analyst, a man who believed in stability, in bonds built with patience, and in promises kept even when the charm of the early days began to give way to the weight of real life. He was 34 years old and had a life story marked by discrete losses, the kind that don't show in tears, but that silence a soul over time. His father had died young, and this forced him to mature too quickly. Perhaps that's why he valued small daily loyalties so much, like remembering his partner's favorite coffee or noticing the tired tone in her voice even when she said everything was fine. Julia, on the other hand, was a woman with a striking presence. She was 31 years old and possessed an energy that was hard to ignore. The kind of person who walks into a room and effortlessly changes the dynamic. With a degree in public relations, she knew how to communicate like few others and used this talent to both charm and protect herself. She was the daughter of a couple who had separated bitterly, so she grew up determined not to repeat her parents' mistakes. At first, this translated into over-idealizing love. Then, into wanting to control it. She needed to feel that she still had power, even when she loved deeply. Their relationship evolved with the fluidity of love stories that don't need to be forced. They moved in together after a year, and 2 years later, they married in an intimate but meaningful ceremony. Anyone looking from the outside would say they were the kind of couple who complemented each other, and for a long time, they truly were. They had different tastes. He loved silence, she preferred loud music, he was a morning person, she functioned better at night, but they found harmony in accepting each other as they were. He admired her for the way she asserted herself at work, the way she laughed at his own bad jokes, the way she left loving notes hidden among his books. She felt safe by his side, loved steadfastly, and this made her trust that, even in difficult times, there would be a safe haven waiting. Their life together was built on a calm cadence. They had their rituals, Sunday nights with movies and wine, impromptu Tuesday lunches with whatever leftovers were in the fridge, silent coffees before the day began. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was honest, with mutual effort. And perhaps that was precisely what kept them so connected for so long, the recognition that love wasn't a series of grand gestures, but rather a sum of small, daily choices. But there was something about Julia that Matthew couldn't fully access. A side of her she kept silent, an inner world she preferred to keep locked away. Sometimes he would watch her distractedly, staring out the window, as if the life she lived with him was good but not enough. She never said so. She never complained of boredom, of a lack of emotion or passion. But there was a sparkle in her eyes, from time to time, that would slowly fade, as if something in her missed being surprised. He noticed it, but didn't know what to do. He thought time and their shared life would fill this subtle void. At work, Julia was beginning to stand out. She attended events, corporate dinners, and out-of-town meetings. The fast pace seemed to please her. She returned from these trips with exciting, detailed stories, and always seemed refreshed. Matthew listened attentively, silently rooting for her, even when he felt the distance growing between them. He tried not to show insecurity, knowing she valued freedom. So he supported her. Even when he wanted to ask her to stay home more. Even when he felt that, with each new project, she was increasingly distant from the routine they had built together. Gradually, their encounters became shorter. The kisses, quicker. The conversations, more about commitments than feelings. There were no arguments. There was no hostility. But there was a silence that was too comfortable, as if they were simply maintaining a tacit agreement to live together. There was still affection, there was still care. But the love, perhaps it was being suffocated by the rush of the days, by the lack of time, or perhaps by something else Matthew didn't yet understand. She remained affectionate, present on important dates, remembered his family's birthdays, and bought thoughtful gifts. And that's why he didn't suspect a thing. Julia was attentive to details. She never failed to say, "Good morning," or text him midday to ask how he was doing. The distance between them wasn't made of coldness, but of excessive warmth. A kind of emotional nurturing that, in a way, camouflaged what was truly being lost there. Matthew, for his part, was beginning to miss something he couldn't quite name. He tried to reconnect with them, proposing trips, home-cooked dinners, nights just for them. She accepted, smiled, and participated, but she frequently returned to her phone, responding to messages, seemingly connected to another world he couldn't access. Still, he persisted. Because he loved her. Because he believed every relationship went through phases like this. Because he believed that, deep down, she felt the same way. Weekends weren't what they used to be. She always had commitments. He adapted. Sometimes he'd go for a walk alone. Other times, he'd stay home and read. He created a parallel routine, but he never failed to include her in his plans. He always made an extra cup of coffee. He always left the porch light on, waiting for her to return. And when she arrived, late and tired, he still hugged her with the same tenderness. Not out of naivete. But by choice. Their apartment was modern and cozy, with large windows and scattered plants that Julia carefully tended. It was a space that carried their identity, his books, her paintings, the pillows chosen on past trips. Every corner told a part of the story they'd built. And perhaps that's why it took him so long to realize that, although the space remained the same, the energy was no longer the same. Something had changed. Something imperceptible, but present. He didn't ask. She didn't say. And life continued in this strange rhythm of silent affection. Neither of them dared touch on what was changing. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of comfort. Maybe because they didn't know how to name that feeling of being together, but not in the same place. The definitive change began subtly. With shorter conversations, less frequent touches, averted glances. Julia was more distracted, more in her own world. And Matthew, though he tried to maintain his composure, began to feel a constant discomfort in his chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was a kind of absence that grew even when she was by his side. He didn't know it yet, but that absence had a name. And soon, very soon, it would become impossible to ignore. The night was clear, the sky silent, but inside, everything was noise. Matthew ran his hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the phone resting on the table. The message was still there, short, direct, and at the same time devastating. Would you mind if I traveled to Paris with my boss? It's a business trip, only 4 days. There wasn't a hint of hesitation in that question. No anticipation of how it would sound. It was almost as if she'd trained those words to sound harmless, professional, neutral. But he felt the impact as if he'd been punched, a punch without warning, without context, striking not his body, but the very core of the trust he'd spent years building. He didn't respond right away. He just stood, paced the living room, and looked around the apartment as if searching for something to hold on to. Then he picked up his phone and typed slowly, taking a deep breath between each word, "You can go, but single." The reply was sent. Silence on the other end came within seconds. She didn't call. She didn't say a single, "What do you mean?" She didn't respond. She remained silent. And in that silence, he understood everything. No explanation, no justification, no sign of regret. Just the silent echo of someone waiting for a reaction that never came. Matthew sat back down, his eyes fixed on the wall. His chest burned, not with anger, but with lucidity. It was as if everything he'd felt for months, the empty stares, the interrupted dinners, the disconnected conversations, finally had a name. He no longer needed proof, suspicion, or confrontation. He had just given her permission to walk out of his life. And the scariest thing was realizing how much that hurt, and yet how liberating it was at the same time. She left. 2 days later, her suitcase packed, her face serene. She simply said she'd be back on Monday, and left with a kiss on the cheek, as if everything was still intact. Matthew stood there, standing in the hallway, watching the door close, with the feeling that this wasn't just a trip. It was the end of the story he tried so hard to preserve. The following days were a rehearsal for silence. He didn't try to find out where she was, didn't ask how the trip was going. He just breathed. He slept poorly, but he slept. He ate little, but he remained standing. Her absence was heavy, but no longer uncertain. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he stood. On Monday, she returned. She entered the house with measured steps, her clothes in order, but her eyes were different. She didn't say much, just dropped her suitcase and went straight to her room. Matthew didn't ask how it was. She didn't tell him. Over dinner, they attempted a superficial conversation about the weather, upcoming appointments, but there was a sharp tension between them, as if any word could trigger a complete collapse. He looked at her silently for a few minutes. There was no guilt in his face. There was no shame. But there was a strange weariness, as if the glow of Paris had lasted less than she'd expected. And that, in a way, affected him. Because he knew what that look meant, it was the look of someone who realized too late what they'd left behind. Weeks passed. And it was on a spring Saturday that everything came to a head. Matthew received an invitation. A close friend, who lived in another city, was getting married the following month. Without a second thought, he confirmed his attendance. It was the kind of invitation he wouldn't have accepted months earlier, when he'd been waiting for Julia to return to the woman he'd married. But now it was different. There was a new serenity about him. A disconcerting calm that was more disturbing than any confrontation. Life was slowly reorganizing itself. And he, for the first time, was making room for the new. What he didn't expect was that, a week before the wedding, he'd receive a call from the groom saying that Julia would also be there, as a date for one of the groomsmen. Matthew listened silently, smiled slightly, and simply said, "We'll see you there." He didn't tell her he was bringing someone. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because he no longer needed to prove anything. The story they'd shared was already over, at least for him. The wedding day arrived. It was a discreet outdoor venue, surrounded by trees and with simple yet elegant decor. Matthew arrived with his new wife at his side. She wore a light blue dress and had a calm smile, the kind that doesn't need to compete with anything, that just exists, serene. The two sat among the guests, talking quietly, exchanging glances that required no performance. The ceremony was about to begin when Julia entered. Her hair loose, a discreet burgundy dress, her posture rigid. She seemed confident. But when her eyes met Matthew's, time seemed to stand still for a moment. She froze. He, in turn, didn't look away. He maintained the same serenity, as if finally finding peace within himself. During the ceremony, Julia avoided looking in his direction. She fidgeted with the ring on her finger, as if searching for something to anchor herself to. The best man beside her seemed engrossed in the event, but she wasn't really there. She was caught up in another scene, another memory. Because now, seeing Matthew with another woman, she finally felt the weight of what she'd lost. Not out of jealousy, but out of the bitter realization that he'd moved on. No shouting, no drama, no revenge. He'd simply moved on. After the ceremony, during the reception, the inevitable happened. Julia approached. With slow steps, a faint, restrained smile. The woman beside Matthew moved away discreetly, giving him space without needing words. Julia stopped in front of him and said, almost in a whisper, "You look different." Matthew nodded with a half-smile and replied, "I'm at peace." She bit her lip lightly, as if trying to contain an emotion that could no longer be contained. She said she thought about him every day. That she had understood things she never wanted to see. That Paris had been a mistake. That her boss, well, he was nothing more than a selfish man who treated her like a whim. She said she regretted it. That she missed the small gestures. That she realized, too late, that love isn't made of new promises, but of memories that endure the test of time. Matthew listened, but not with anger or pleasure. He listened like someone listening to an old story. When she finished, he took a deep breath. He looked into her eyes and said, "I loved you with everything I had. But what's left of us doesn't fit here anymore." She tried to insist, saying she would change, that she wanted a second chance. But he just shook his head. "I'm not that man anymore. And you're not that woman anymore either. What's left of us is a story. And stories, Julia, don't repeat themselves. They're told. And then they're kept." She stood there, motionless, swallowing her pain in silence. She looked at his new wife, who smiled as she chatted with other guests. She realized she had lost something that cannot be regained with regret. That trust, once broken, does not last. And that love, when it departs silently, never returns the same. And it was at that wedding that everything was revealed. Not with screams, but with a scene. She, dressed in red, among the guests, with tears in her eyes, watching the man who was once hers now belonged to another world. A world she herself pushed away. And in that moment, everything fell silent. Because sometimes, the true punishment is watching from afar what you destroyed up close. The weeks following the wedding passed in absolute silence between them, as if they both knew any words would be useless. Since that night, Julia had been waking up earlier, but not out of routine or motivation. It was the insomnia of absence. The emptiness of what never returns. She tried to move on with her life, work, fill her time, but everything seemed too small compared to what she had destroyed with an impulsive choice. The pain didn't come from abandonment, but from a realization. She hadn't been abandoned. She was the one who left. And now that she wanted to return, the door was locked from the inside, not out of resentment, but out of peace. She tried to maintain contact with some people they had in common, but everyone's distance was evident. Friends who had once praised her now spoke cautiously, as if ashamed of her. And that weighed more heavily than any direct criticism. Matthew, on the other hand, continued living in silence, but now a comfortable silence. The apartment had changed, not in its decor, but in its energy. The new love that had arrived in his life brought serenity. She demanded nothing, didn't demand explanations about the past. With her, everything was built calmly, patiently, with a maturity that didn't require constant proof of love. You simply loved and respected each other, without performance. The two of them walked a different path together, and even though Matthew still carried scars, he knew he no longer needed to hide or explain any of them. Because now, they were respected. He knew the forgiveness he had given Julia was sincere, but it wasn't to start over. It was to free himself. A few months later, Julia tried one last approach. She sent a long, heartfelt, handwritten letter, pouring out everything she'd kept inside. She spoke of her disappointment with her boss, of the life she'd envisioned outside of marriage, of the nights she'd spent staring at the ceiling of the apartment where she now lived alone. She recounted how all the glow of freedom faded the moment she realized she had nowhere to return. She apologized not for her actions themselves, but for not having the courage to fight for the relationship when there was still time. She spoke of how empty she felt, displaced from the world, as if the only part of her that truly made sense had been left behind. And in the end, she left only one short sentence: "I understood too late that true love doesn't scream, doesn't beg. It simply goes. And when it goes, it never comes back." Matthew read the letter. He didn't reply. He folded it carefully and placed it in a box where he kept some mementos from his old life, a photo of them smiling on the beach, a movie ticket, a birthday card. He put it there, closed the box, and put it back on the top shelf of the closet. Not out of longing, but out of respect for the story they'd shared. And then he moved on. Because love, when it's true, doesn't need to be punished to go away. It only dries up when it's not reciprocated. And that's what happened. He didn't take revenge, he didn't humiliate, he didn't wish harm. He simply moved on with the dignity she lost the moment she chose to test the love he gave her completely. Julia now lives in a smaller apartment. You work in a demanding but unfulfilling position. To those unfamiliar with her story, she appears strong, independent, and determined. But inside, she's all silence and regret. Sometimes you walk the streets hoping to run into him by chance, even though you know he avoids the same places you once frequented together. She watches his life from afar, through the social media of mutual friends. You see the photos of their trips, the simple dinners, the genuine smiles. And you feel everything that could have been. But it isn't anymore. Because there are pains that only those who have lost true love know. Pains that can't be healed by new relationships, or apologies, or time. They are wounds that reopen every time she closes her eyes and remembers the last time she saw him, smiling, holding hands with another woman, about to begin the life that was once offered to her. Matthew, in turn, found a new purpose. Not just in his relationship, but in the way he chose to live. He helped people close to him overcome difficult breakups, counseled friends, and wrote short chronicles about new beginnings. He hadn't become a hero, nor a role model, just someone who survived a broken love and knew how to rebuild without bitterness. He wasn't seeking more intensity. He was seeking truth. And the woman by his side understood this. She didn't need to fill old spaces, just walk beside him with ease. Together, they created new rituals, new memories, new promises. They didn't talk much about the past, but they knew it existed. And that was what made the present even more precious. Time passed. Pain remained for those who chose to flee certainty for fantasy. And love? Love didn't end. It simply changed places. If before I lived in memories and expectations, now I lived in tranquility and gratitude. Julia, when she lay down at night, knew there was no greater punishment than remembering every day what she had destroyed with her own hands. Not out of malice, but out of immaturity, vanity, impulse. And this awareness was a constant echo in her life. An echo that said, you had it all. And you chose to let it go. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath and comment, what would you have done in each of their shoes? Leave your opinion in the comments below, we want to hear what you thought of this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this. Here, each plot is designed to move you and make you reflect on the choices we make. And here's the most important reminder of all, cheating isn't freedom, it's not empowerment, it's not a justifiable mistake. It's a choice that destroys homes, feelings, memories, and lives. This channel never supports any kind of cheating. Our purpose is to show, through fiction, the real weight of the decisions we make when we forget the value of true love. Sometimes the greatest punishment isn't being abandoned. It's realizing, too late, that you were the one abandoned.